Hello my friends and welcome to the channel. This is Thorgernick of Thorgernick Gaming, and today we are bringing you my Protection Warrior guide for Battle for Azeroth patch 8.0.1 level 120 into Mythic Dungeons for all the gears as we get ready to raid. So let's dive right in. In this guide we're going to be talking about talents, the rotation, sort of rotation-ish. You don't have as set a rotation as a tank, obviously, as you do compared to a DPS. We're talking about talents, rotation, cooldowns, utility, some of the Azerite traits, stat priorities, and then at the end we'll talk about a couple of macros that I think are useful, as well as Weakauras and my ElvUI profile. But if you like what you're hearing, if you are new to the channel, welcome. And if you like the content that we're putting out, we put out a lot of World of Warcraft content. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. So, without further ado, let's dive right into the Prot Warrior and talk about the talents. So there have been quite a few changes to the Prot talent tree going from Legion into BFA. Some of the most changed rows and talents in general in the game for any individual spec. So let's talk about what we've got. In Tier 15, we've got Into the Fray, Punish, and Impending Victory. Generally, you're going to want to go with Punish for single target encounters and Into the Fray for that sweet haste buff in dungeon or group encounters where you can get multiple stacks of it, or there's going to be a lot of mobs up. One important thing to know about End of the Fray in Battle for Azeroth is that you now gain haste for each enemy or ally. In Legion it was just for each enemy within 10 yards. Now it includes allies, so if you have your healer with you standing within 10 yards, or if you just have a couple of melee DPS in your group, you'll get more stacks of the buff, of the haste buff, making it more valuable than it otherwise would be. However, if you're in a raid encounter and you're probably only going to have the boss and maybe your co-tank within range of you, then Punish is going to be the superior talent, both for single target DPS and because you will get a little bit of damage reduction out of it. Impending Victory may be situational if you have a fight where there's a lot of adds that you're getting kills on pretty regularly, but overall the 30-second cooldown makes this kind of prohibitive as far as usage goes. But if you think you might need that heal, it's worth considering. Overall, I would go for Into the Fray for group content or anything where you're going to have at least 3 to 4 stacks of the buff consistently, and then Punish for single target raid encounters. Tier 30, we've got Crackling's Thunder, Bounding Stride, and Safeguard. Bounding Stride is probably going to be your default choice here. Crackling Thunder can be really nice in dungeons if you need to pick up a lot of adds that don't want to get in close to you. And Safeguard can be actually really nice in tank swap encounters where you want to take a little bit of damage off of your co-tank, or if you want to keep your healer up, keep some damage off of someone else that's gotten some aggro. Safeguard can be really good depending on how you use your intercept. Tier 45, we've got Best Served Cold, Unstoppable Force, and Dragon Roar. Generally, Unstoppable Force is going to be your go-to here. With this talent, you get to use Thunderclap every other global cooldown while Avatar is up, and this gives you incredible AoE DPS as a tank, which is really nice because that's going to increase your threat in dungeon scenarios where your DPS may or may not be focusing one target, and that target may or may not be the one that you're focusing as a tank. And it's also going to give you just a lot more threat and a lot more damage and a lot more rage because Thunderclap generates 5 rage now. Dragon Roar can be good if you need the burst DPS or if you need the slow, and it does give you a little bit of on-demand rage generation, but overall I like Unstoppable Force a lot more than Dragon Roar. Tier 60, Indomitable, Never Surrender, and Bolster. This is really going to be a choice between Indomitable and Bolster, and that's going to come down to, am I tanking content that I really don't have enough health to survive against? Then you'll take Indomitable. Otherwise, Bolster is just so much better than Never Surrender that you'll probably want to take this in almost every scenario, period. Tier 75, we've got Menace, Rumbling Earth, and Stormbolt. And this is going to come down to how you want to deliver your CC. So Stormbolt gives you a single target stun that it has a 20-yard range on top of your baseline Shockwave, which has just a 10-yard range in front of you but is an AoE stun. So you can take Stormbolt in addition to Shockwave and give yourself 2 stuns, one of them which is single target, but it's also at range. So if you have a caster that gets away from you or that you can't really bring in yet, but you want to stop it casting, you can throw a Stormbolt at it. On the other hand, Rumbling Earth is going to give you the mechanic of cooldown reduction on your Shockwave. Now, Shockwave baseline is a 40-second cooldown. With Rumbling Earth, if you hit at least 3 targets, it's down to a 25-second cooldown. The thing that really is frustrating about this talent is that was baseline behavior of Shockwave. Granted, when Shockwave was a talent, but it was baseline behavior for Shockwave in previous iterations of the ability, and it was actually a 20-second cooldown reduction. So now, yes, we get Shockwave baseline, but if we want to talent into that gameplay where if you hit at least 3 targets, its cooldown is reduced, we're taking a talent slot away from something else, and we're not getting as much as we used to get out of it. Menace gives you a little bit more freedom to use Intimidating Shout. Now, Intimidating Shout is a powerful ability. It's an AoE fear, but it's also a very dangerous ability to use in group content because you're going to send the mobs scattering in whatever random direction they choose to run in. And that could result in 5 mobs being feared and 5 mobs pulling 5 additional packs of adds. So this could easily wipe your group. Menace gives you a lot more freedom to use it. The problem is it's still just a fear. So if you're doing heavy AoE damage, it's going to break pretty quickly. You're not going to get the full duration out of it. You're certainly not going to take advantage of the extra 4 seconds that it adds. And overall, it just makes it kind of an AoE interrupt. But I think you're a lot better served by choosing Rumbling Earth or Stormbolt in this tier. Personally, I like Stormbolt because having that ranged stun gives you a lot more utility with how you're going to use your stuns. But Rumbling Earth is powerful as well if you need more AoE stuns than you have access to out of the gate. Tier 90, Booming Voice and Vengeance and Devastator. Booming Voice is going to be your go-to here in almost every scenario. It gives you 40 rage whenever you use Demo Shout, Demoralizing Shout, and then it gives you increased damage to those targets, which is really, really nice in any situation. Vengeance is pretty much exactly the same as it was in Legion, except that Ignore Pain is nowhere near as powerful as it was in Legion. So Vengeance hasn't been nerfed directly. Well, it has by 2%. It's gone from 33% to 35 to 33%. Rage cost reduction, but it's been nerfed more heavily because Ignore Pain is not nearly as important and usable. So weaving a Revenge and Ignore Pain together is not really the same power level of gameplay as it used to be. And Devastator, because it no longer gives you rage from your auto attacks, is not really worthwhile anymore. If you don't like the gameplay of using Devastate, then you can take this and it will overall give you more shield slam resets because you're going to get them from your auto attacks. It does have a lower chance than Devastate baseline, but you're going to be getting a lot more applications of Devastator than you have GCDs to use on Devastate. But overall, Booming Voice is a very powerful talent, and Vengeance and Devastator are just not nearly as strong as it in almost any situation that I can imagine. And then Tier 100, Anger Management, Heavy Repercussions, and Ravager. Ravager is really not worth taking for protection. You have stronger cooldowns than Ravager. The 35% parry is pretty nice in combination with the baseline avoidance that you're going to have from your gear, but you don't really need that extra cooldown. One of the things we'll talk about in this guide is that protection has a ton of cooldowns already, and it's a lot better choice to take Anger Management to get those extra access to all of the cooldowns that you already have. And if you don't need access to those cooldowns, then Heavy Repercussions is a very strong talent to take instead of Anger Management. So I don't really see a situation where you would want to take Ravager. The DPS is okay, but Prot already has pretty strong AoE damage, and you're going to be, if you're taking Unstoppable Force, you don't really need the burst AoE that Ravager is going to provide. I mean, you can take it, sure, but I think you're going to be better served by Anger Management or Heavy Repercussions in almost any other scenario. So that covers the talents. The recommended build that I would go to for dungeon play would be Into the Fray, Bounding Stride, Unstoppable Force, Bolster, probably Rumbling Earth, although Stormbolt has a very strong case to be made for it, Booming Voice, and Anger Management. And then the change that I would make to this in raid content would be just punish. And then if you want to take heavy repercussions, you can as well. You could take safeguard in raids if you want to be smart with how you intercept and use it on your co-tank if they're taking a lot of damage. But overall, that extra mobility is really strong from Bounding Stride. Punish is going to be stronger in single target raid encounters than Into the Fray is, but overall most of the talent choices are going to be the same between the two, obviously with the one difference being taking Punish or Into the Fray in tier 15. So, moving on from the talents, we'll talk about the rotation. So the rotation for Prot is actually relatively simple on a baseline level. You're going to use Shield Slam on cooldown, you're going to use Thunderclap on cooldown, and then you're going to use Devastate for filler. You want to keep up shield block at least 100%, at least you want to keep it up as much as you can. You're not going to be able to get it up 100% of the time, but keep it up as much as you can while you are actively tanking, with a couple of caveats. One is you don't want to waste any uptime of shield block. So for an example, if you have a tank swap coming up in 2 seconds, you should hold on to your charges of shield block and save them, because if you're not going to be tanking for 4 of the 6 seconds that shield block lasts, then it's not worth it to use it. It's better to save that charge for when you're actively tanking the next time, because you're going to want more uptime overall over the course of the fight. So you want to be maximizing uptime while you are tanking. The other caveat to that is if you're, let's say you're in a dungeon and you have one pull that's almost done, there's one mob up, and that mob is going to die in 4 seconds. You probably just want to hold off shield block until you are pulling the next group. So keep shield block up while tanking, but use it intelligently. Don't just blindly press it all the time. And then lastly, you're going to want to spend your excess rage, because you will not spend all of the rage that's coming in on shield block. You simply don't have enough charges of it to spend all that rage. So the excess rage you're going to use on Revenge for damage and for fishing for shield slam resets. And then if you need more mitigation, use Ignore Pain in place of Revenge. Now you don't want to spam these abilities, Revenge and Ignore Pain, to the point where you can't keep shield block up, because obviously you're losing a lot more mitigation in the long run by doing that. But you do want to use them to dump excess rage, just to make sure that you're not capping and that you're floating somewhere between, let's say, 40 and 75 to 80 rage most of the time. One other thing that we need to mention is watch your threat, particularly in AoE encounters and trash in dungeons. You need to be on top of it with your threat in dungeons. Threat has been reduced for tanks dramatically from Legion into VFA, not to the point where you're going to lose threat in a single target encounter, but to the point where if you are pulling, especially multiple trash packs, you need to be tab targeting. You need to be making sure that you're not losing threat on any target, because if you're just doing your AoE rotation and that's the only damage that's going out to mobs, and another DPS is focusing on one of those mobs, you really need to pay attention to make sure they don't turn around and kill the rogue that's in your group, for example. So pay attention to your threat, watch your threat, be willing to tab target, be ready to manually target something else and get your taunt off. Be ready to do that, because threat is a big deal, especially in dungeons and trash encounters. So that covers the rotation section. Let's talk about cooldowns next. So we have a couple of rotational abilities that we've already talked about a little bit. Shield block. Ignore Pain technically doesn't have a cooldown, but I'm treating it like a rotational cooldown. So we already talked about this a bit, but you want to make sure that you're maximizing active uptime of shield block. So if something is actively attacking you and you're going to get full benefit from a shield block, you want to use it. Ignore Pain you want to use to fill in the gaps. If your health is getting lower, it makes sense to use an Ignore Pain just to try to give your healer a little bit of extra time to get you back up. But overall, Ignore Pain is not nearly as strong as it was in Legion. It only ignores 50% of the damage rather than 90% of the damage, and the total damage relative to your health that it ignores is also lower. So be mindful of that. Use it as a mitigation tool, but it's not your bread and butter. It's not what's going to save you at the end. It will save a lot of healer mana, and it'll give your healers a chance to catch up, but if Ignore Pain is all that you have left, ooh, you're probably going to die. So our longer cooldowns, we'll just go through these in alphabetical order as they appear in the spellbook. First up, we've got Avatar. This is your offensive cooldown. It also does have a defensive component if you have taken if you have taken Unstoppable Force, because it will allow you to use Thunderclap more often, and Thunderclap gives you 5 rage, so you'll get more rage during Avatar, so keep that in mind when you're using it. Primarily it's an offensive cooldown, but there is a defensive component to it, so maybe if you've popped Avatar, you want to hold off on using another defensive cooldown unless you're taking a lot of damage coming in, but just be mindful of that and be aware of that. Demoralizing Shout. This is a very strong cooldown. It gives you 20% damage reduction against all mobs that you hit, all mobs that are within 10 yards when you use it. And it is active. It is up every 45 seconds, and it lasts for 8 seconds. So this has a pretty high uptime out of the gate, and it is a very strong cooldown that you want to be making use of pretty much on cooldown. Obviously, if there's nothing attacking you, you want to hold off on using it a little bit, but you'll want to use Demoralizing Shout as often as you can, make use of that damage reduction during an encounter. If you're in something like a Mythic Dungeon, this is a great ability to use at or near the start of every single pull, because it will give your healer a chance to make sure that you're hotted up or you've got a shield on you, make sure that your damage isn't spiky right into the pull. It's just a very important ability to use frequently. Next up, Last Stand. Now, Last Stand, we talked about Bolster as a recommended talent, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more in conjunction with Last Stand, because this is an incredibly powerful cooldown ability. So Last Stand gives you 30% additional health, and it heals you for the amount of health that it gains you. So if you have, let's just use flat numbers, if you have 100,000 health, it's going to increase your health to 130,000, and it's going to heal you for 30,000 health during that time. So you can use Last Stand by default every 3 minutes. If you've taken Bolster, its cooldown is shortened to 2 minutes. And in addition to giving you more health and giving you a big heal, Bolster also causes Last Stand to give you essentially free shield block for its duration, which is 15 seconds. So for 15 seconds, you will block all melee attacks. That means that you don't have to use any charges of shield block during it, and you shouldn't, because they'll essentially be wasted during that time. The one caveat to that is if you need to get some more damage out and you want to use shield block offensively, a little bit more of an aggressive playstyle. But if you're popping Last Stand, you probably don't. It's probably not the time to be using an aggressive playstyle, right? You're trying to survive. But you can use it every 2 minutes. This is further reduced by Anger Management, so this ability is up very frequently, and it should probably be the first ability that you use if you are taking a lot of damage, or if you think you're about to take a lot of damage. So Last Stand, very important ability, gives you a big health boost. If you're taking my recommended talent build, it will also give you shield block for 15 seconds while it is active. Next up, we've got Rallying Cry. Now this kind of spills over into the utility section. I'm going to talk about it here as a tank cooldown because it does give you 15% additional health. It applies to your entire raid, so if you want to hold on to it, this is probably going to be the last defensive ability that you have that you use as a personal defensive, but you need to think about it as a personal defensive because one of your first priorities as a tank is making sure that you survive the encounter. So if you've already used all of your other defensives and Rallying Cry is the only thing you have left, but it's going to be the difference between you surviving and dying, then you should use Rallying Cry, even if you might need it a little bit later for just to help out the group to survive. Rallying Cry is an important ability to use wisely and intelligently, but also you can use it to make sure that you survive and your group doesn't wipe. It will give your entire raid 15% max health, and for that duration, they will all gain 15% health. So going back to that number, let's say you have 100k health and you're at 50,000 health. Well, it's going to bump you up by 15% on both of those, but it's going to bring you back down to the same percentage once it ends. So you're not going to keep that extra health that you gain from using it. So it's a little bit less powerful on that front compared to Last Stand. It's a lot less powerful because it's half of the health, but Rallying Cry is an important ability to be aware of and to use when you really, really need to. And lastly, for our defensives, we've got, well, the last big defensive that we've got here is Shield Wall. This is your classic tank defensive ability. You'll reduce all damage you take by 40% for 8 seconds. It's on a long cooldown of 4 minutes, but that does get reduced by Anger Management, so you'll have access to it more often than that. This is an ability that you use if you know heavy damage is incoming, if you suspect that you're going to get low on health. If you're already low on health, it might be too late to use Shield Wall. You probably want to use it more in the 50 to 60% health range, just to make sure that you don't get too low to begin with. And just overall as a warrior, that's something that you need to be aware of. If your health gets below 20%, you're in a lot of trouble because you don't have any real ways beyond popping Last Stand to get your health back up on your own. You are reliant on your healer to get your health back up for you. You know, Demon Hunters, Death Knights, they have some abilities that they can use to spam heal themselves and try to really counteract that. You don't have that as a warrior, so you need to be using your toolkit to prevent that damage from happening in the first place. Ideally, as a warrior, you're not dropping down into dangerous health levels at all unless the fight is already going to be a wipe, right? So be using your shield wall a little bit more aggressively than you might if you were playing a class that had decent self-healing, but use it to reduce damage when you think you're going to be taking a lot of damage and you're already starting to get in a little bit of trouble. Okay? And then next up we've got Spell Reflection. Now, a lot of spells in PvE, especially in raids, are not reflectable, but Spell Reflection does reduce the magical damage that you take by 20%, so bear that in mind. Now that window of damage reduction only lasts until a spell is reflected, so if you do reflect a spell, you won't mitigate further magical damage, but if you have magic damage incoming that is not reflectable, you can still use this to mitigate that damage, which is really powerful because most tanks don't have anything that can mitigate magical damage in BFA. It's also on a short cooldown of just 25 seconds, so be mindful of that, be aware of that, and be aggressive in using your Spell Reflect, either to reflect big damage spells that you can, or just to reduce magic damage that you're taking to begin with, because you can't block spells and warriors are all about the blocks. And lastly, we need to talk about Victory Rush. So you don't have a reliable self-heal as a warrior, but you do have Victory Rush, and if you make good use of it, you can actually get some good healing out. So if you're in group content and you're doing big pulls and you can sneak in some killing blows, you can get Victory Rush and get 20% heals on a somewhat regular basis. One of the things that I have in my Weakauras is a big shiny Victory Rush icon that appears when I have the Victory Rush buff, when I have it available, and I would really recommend doing that. If you don't use my Weakauras, if you set up your own, make sure that you have something that lets you know that Victory Rush is available so that you can use it to gain some health back. It's the one self-heal that we have. We should make really good use of it when it is available, even though that's going to be very rare in raid encounters. Okay, so we talked about the cooldowns. Next up is utility, and first up, I want to talk about Pummel because interrupts are very important. As a tank, you should make yourself a integral part of the interrupt rotation in your group. You should be communicating with your team members. As when I'm tanking, I like to be the first person interrupting a spell. I will say I will get the first interrupt, I'll get the third interrupt, or however often it needs to happen that the cooldowns line up. Make yourself an integral part of that because that is part of your role in preventing damage, not only to yourself but also to the group. We've already talked about this a little bit, but Shockwave is very important utility for the Protection Warrior because not many people have an AoE stun anymore, and Protection does. So make use of Shockwave whenever you can stun targets with it, particularly if you can line up an entire pull, let's say, I don't know, however many mobs you can hit with it, you can use it and get 2 seconds of an AoE stun. Berserker Rage is a really nice tool to have as a Protection Warrior because it basically makes you able to cheese fear mechanics. Make sure that you're making use of that whenever fears are going out. Intimidating Shout, we talked about this a little bit in the dangers of it, but it is a useful tool if you need an AoE interrupt because you can fear all the targets that are casting. Now this isn't going to be an interrupt that's going to lock them out of those spells. Oftentimes mobs will continue casting their spells, but if you time it right, you can delay the damage that they're doing and maybe get a kill in on those mobs, or maybe delay it until another stun comes up or until your interrupt is off of cooldown. And so you can use that in group content, but be very careful when you're using it because mobs will run away and you want to make sure that they don't pull a bunch of additional packs. Battle Shout, we need to be aware of. This is our AoE buff. This is the attack power buff. Only warriors bring this, so if you're the only warrior in your group, make sure that you're casting it for your group. Make sure that you recast it if people die. And then lastly, I want to talk about warriors' mobility. Mobility is, I think, one of the utility things that warriors bring to a group. We don't have quite as much as a demon hunter, a little bit less than a monk, but between intercept and heroic leap, you can do some really amazing things as a warrior. Intercept, especially if you use it on an ally, you can use this to get anywhere around the field that you need to be, that you want to be, just to make sure that you are preventing as much damage to your group as you possibly can. So think about your mobility and those two abilities that we have, specifically intercept and heroic leap. Think about those as another form of utility. Okay, next up, let's talk about Azerite gear. Now, there are some really nice Azerite traits for protection, and the most important one that you can get by far on one slot, and just one slot, is Deafening Crash. What this will do is give you much higher uptime on your Demoralizing Shout debuff, because every time you Thunderclap, you're going to extend the duration of Demo Shout by 2 seconds on any enemies that you hit with it. You don't get that benefit of it from multiple traits, so you just want to get this on one piece of Azerite gear. So if you have 2 pieces with it, you don't extend it by 4 seconds, you just get the damage bonus. But you do want to have that on one piece of gear so that you can get higher uptime on Demo Shout. In addition to that, we've got some other good choices. Iron Fortress, Brace for Impact, and Reinforced Plating are all good choices. They're not as good as Deafening Crash, but again, you only want Deafening Crash on one piece of your Azerite gear. So choose between those 3, or generally just take the tanking trait that the piece of gear has, or if there's one of the zone bonuses that gives you a haste buff, I would recommend against taking something that has, like, gives you haste or mastery or crit. If something gives you specifically a haste buff, though, that can be worth taking, as haste is our best stat for Prot. But you want to get Deafening Crash on one, and then the other traits I would shoot for would be Iron Fortress, Brace for Impact, and Reinforced Plating. And beyond that, well, there are other good traits. If you get something that's a really big item level upgrade, though, like let's say you're going 340 all the way to 370, just take the tanking trait on it, and you'll probably do just fine. So related to Azerite gear, let's talk about the stat priority. Now, the stat priority for protection is not quite as set in stone as Arms and Fury is. The one thing that you want to be concerned about is your stamina. Make sure that you have enough stamina that you're not getting crushed before your heroes have a chance to get you up. But stamina is going to come naturally on gear. You don't really have to gear specifically for it. If you have higher item level pieces, that's generally going to be what you go for anyway, so your stamina is probably going to be sufficient for the content that you're actually tanking. Beyond that, the general stat priority for Prot is going to be haste is number 1. Mastery and versatility are roughly equal, with the slight edge going to versatility if there's magical damage, and the slight edge going to mastery if there's no magical damage. And then behind that we have crit, and then strength is bringing up the rear. But all of these stats are actually pretty close to each other, to the point where if you have something that's an item level upgrade, period, it's probably worth equipping it. The one exception on that would be in the ring slots, where you have a chance to optimize secondaries just a little bit, but overall more stats is going to be better than less stats for Prot. And obviously trinkets, if you have a trinket that has a really good survivability trait, that can be worth a lot more than one that doesn't have any survivability trait regardless of item level. So keep those things in mind. And the last thing that I want to talk about is add-ons. So a lot of people like to run Omen, the threat meter add-on. Personally, I really have just a fine time observing threat and dealing with threat using the default UI. There's a glow that happens around mobs, and even with ElvUI it has this as well. There's a glow that happens around their health bar on top of their heads if you're losing threat. So make sure that you switch to those targets. If you want to use a threat meter, Omen is good and has been for a long time. The 2 that I use and highly recommend, well, the 3 that I would highly recommend would be ElvUI, just because it streamlines the basic UI. It gives you a lot more information where you want it on the screen. Having your health bar, your focus, everything set up right where you want it is really nice, and the way that it has a grid to help you lay that out is perfect. I'll include a link to my ElvUI profile in the description below. And the other one would be Weakauras. Weakauras are invaluable because it allows you to track your cooldowns and your resource and anything else that you want to have, any buffs or debuffs that you care about tracking on the middle of your screen. I'll include a link to my Prot Weakauras as well in the description below. I'll just include one to my Warrior Weakauras, which will give you Prot, Arms, and Fury if you want to grab those. And so that's what I would recommend running with, those three to four add-ons. You can run with a damage meter too if you want. I like Details. I used Recount for a long time. Wasn't really a big fan of Skada, but Details is really good. It's what I'm using now because I was having issues with Recount and Legion, and I switched and just liked it, so I stuck with it. So that concludes the guide. If you made it this far, congratulations, and thank you for watching this guide. I hope you find it helpful. I hope you enjoy the information that's been presented, and I hope it helps you in your tanking. If you like the video, give it a like, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel but you like the content, please consider subscribing. And until next time, take care of yourselves, and peace.